Hi, everyone. Welcome to June, and thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 400 library systems across the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so excited to have Smithsonian Curator Matt Shindell with us to talk to you about a human history of the red planet, as can be read about in his book, For the Love of Mars. Before we jump in, I want to give you all that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then I'll turn things over to Matt. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you for doing that. But you can also submit questions during this live presentation by clicking the questions button that's below the live stream video. If you've already put yourself in full screen mode, you might want to hit the escape button so that you can see those tabs below the live stream video. There are quite a few of you tuning in today. So we will take as many questions as we can during the Q&A period, but just keep in mind that there are a lot of you tuning in. Now to formally introduce our guest for today. Matthew Shindell, PhD, is a historian of science with a background in science studies. He is a curator of Earth and planetary science at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He is responsible for the museum's collection of spacecraft instruments and other artifacts related to the exploration and study of our Earth and solar system. He co-hosts the museum's podcast, Airspace. He curated the museum's permanent exhibition, Exploring the Planets, and is leading a curatorial team developing the exhibition Futures in Space. Shindell is the author of For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet, and The Life and Science of Harold C. Urey, co-author of Spaceships, Our Future in Space, and Discerning Experts, and co-editor of Smithsonian American Women. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for being here. I'll turn things over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to the Library Speakers Consortium for having me here today. And thanks to all of you for coming to this talk. It's really great to be able to share, the journey that I went on in writing this book, For the Love of Mars. So this is a book talk, and this is the book, For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet. It was published last year by the University of Chicago Press. And it is a work of history of science. So maybe we should start by just talking a little bit about what is the history of science. So, what is science? I like to think about science as, not just something that happens in laboratories or that's in textbooks, but that's an activity that's taken many and sometimes contradictory forms over the course of human history. And we really find it everywhere if we construe it broadly. Everywhere that we find groups of people asking questions about their world and generating knowledge about their world. And I say groups because I think of science as a social activity that's done by communities of people in dialogue, either with their contemporaries or, their antecedents, with the wisdom of the ancients, so to speak. And history is just one way of piecing these stories together, of taking what records exist from previous times and cultures and trying to fit what they knew and the projects that they initiated to learn about their world with the ways that they lived, what their values were, how they understood their relationship to the world, their relationships to each other, and what were their anxieties and their preoccupations, and how did those things affect the knowledge that they created. So that defines my approach to this book and to the history of science more generally. And in doing this, I've not focused so much on, a history of Mars as, what did people get right and what did they get wrong? Instead, I've focused on the people who cared about Mars and the questions they asked about it. And I really was trying to get to know Mars through their eyes so that I could sort of, share that with you, the reader. So let me introduce a short cast of characters of sort of mutual friends of the planet Mars. So here we have a temple in the city-state of Palenque, located symbolically at the center of the Mayan cosmos, where a Mayan priest might look up at three planets lined up from east to west in the night sky above this temple of inscriptions. And in fact, on one night in the 600s, he saw Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars lined up there. And he and the assembled crowd, what they saw when they looked at those planets were three gods who gave birth to their ancient ancestors. And when they disappeared behind the tomb in which their new king's father had recently been laid to rest, this confirmed for them the transfer of celestial power from father to son. And we'll get more into all of these examples later, but we're going to just introduce them right now. So, for example, here's our next one. Several centuries later, on the other side of the world, a 14th century Italian poet imagines a journey through the heavens, conceived as a set of nested spheres that hold the planets, stars, and the domain of God and the angels. And in this journey, Mars will be one of the stops, and the poet will give the planet new significance that it hasn't had before. And then jumping to the 17th century, a Jesuit scholar in Rome who imagines a similar journey through the heavens that for the first time treats Mars and the other planets as actual solid worlds that one can visit. His rendering of Mars is shaped by ideas about Christianity, astronomy, alchemy, and magic, combined with the new observations of Galileo and others who were using the telescope to actually see the planets a little bit more resolved than they had before. And here we go in the early 20th century, a wealthy astronomer from Boston builds an observatory in the mountains of Flagstaff, Arizona to observe Mars. And his obsession with the red planet and its possible inhabitants here reflects his own anxieties about the eventual fate of Earth and the need for a well-structured social hierarchy. And then last, here in the 21st century, sitting in this chair, a museum curator working with scientists to build a gallery about the exploration of our solar system and writing a book about Mars. And we can't really talk about the exploration of the planets without talking about Mars. Aside from Earth, it's the most explored planet in our solar system. And this is mainly thanks to these technologies in front of you, these three generations of rovers, along with orbiters, that have been made possible really by how we live on Earth. Rockets that were born from our military and national security needs, computers and communications technologies that have become ubiquitous and essential for our work and our social lives, robotics that's transforming the way work is done, and networks for sharing information around the globe. And it also, of course, connects to our ideas about the purpose of Mars, right? Its connection to Earth and dreams of one day sending humans there to explore or even settle the red planet. But before we get to the robots, let's step back for a second. For most of human history, the red rocky world that you see on the right was not what people saw in the sky when they looked at Mars. So what did they see? Since so many ancient cultures associated Mars with bad omens, we can speculate that these associations go back very deep in the human past. And where do those come from? Mars, in its appearance in the night sky, can have a blood red appearance. Mars can be noticeably bright and red, especially when it comes near to Earth during a close opposition. And what we mean by opposition is, the Earth and Mars are in two different orbits. Mars orbits just on the outside of Earth's orbit and orbits the sun about it takes 2 years for Mars to complete an orbit, 2 Earth years. So every 2 years or so, Earth and Mars sort of line up with the sun in what's called an opposition. And because Mars is in an elliptical orbit, that opposition happens at different distances. But as you can see in the moving diagram on the bottom left of your screen, when that happens, when Earth overtakes Mars in their orbits, it actually makes Mars appear to look as though it's moving backwards for a short time. And of course, because Mars and Earth are very close to each other when that happens, Mars is incredibly bright compared to its usual appearance when that happens. And so what you see on the top left is what that path would look like in the sky But of course, it can look different because Mars and Earth don't always pass each other in the same place, and Mars's orbit is elliptical, which makes it means that Mars could be at a different distance from the Earth at the time that opposition happens. Um, but the color of Mars, as I said, can get very bright during opposition. Other times, its color can resemble wheat. It can be as bright as a burning ember. It can seem not only alive, but impetuous and maybe even sinister because of its seemingly unpredictable motions. And that irregular motion in the sky may have seemed to many observers like a wounded animal wandering among the stars. Um, Wrong button. There we go. Several ancient skywatching cultures that developed sophisticated understandings of what they witnessed in the sky also related these sky events to how their societies were structured and governed. They saw themselves as being in conversation with their gods, and all saw themselves as co participants with the gods in maintaining the order or harmony of the natural world. So, Mayan civilization, which we saw the temple in Palenque earlier, emerged in the southern part of Mesoamerica on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and in parts of Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, um, and began to take root as early as around 1500 BCE. The Maya lived in a universe in which everything was alive with spiritual power and in which little was really inanimate. The zoomorph that you see in this image here is one archaeologists have named the Mars beast. This here is from one of the codexes that remains of this ancient period. But what you can see here is that it's a chimera of various animal features. The beast itself is hanging upside down from segments of a sky band, and you can read this kind of like a comic book image, progressing from left to right with the body of the Mars beast hanging lower and lower down as the path or as the sequence progresses. And what that is you know the the Mars beast hanging down from the sky band, moving through the sun's annual path through the stars and through the constellations. And it seems to be peeking out from those constellations. And what it seems to be doing, as I said, is becoming brighter, showing more of itself. So maybe what we're seeing here, archaeologists suggest, is Mars going into opposition, becoming brighter, redder, changing direction in the sky, like the diagram that I just showed you in the previous slide. And archaeologists have argued that the Mars beast was not necessarily a bad omen, as it was in many other cultures, but maybe a sign here of seasonal change. So the tables in which the beast appears are known as the water tables, and they correspond to the tropical growing seasons. So maybe the Maya found a connection between the erratic motion of Mars and the seasons. That could have been very valuable astrological or astronomical knowledge to have when your population is sort of burgeoning to 2 million people, and is only made possible by a very vast agricultural system. That sort of seasonal knowledge is, of course, very valuable. And, in this case, seems to perhaps have, resulted in this interesting um, demigod of the Mars beast. But as I said in the introduction, when I first introduced Palenque, Mars could play other roles as well. It wasn't always the Mars beast. Um, as I said before, the planets were understood to participate in community life. Palaces and temples in Maya's city-states were designed so that events in the night sky could take part in communal events. Astronomer, astrologer, priests were employed by the royal families who ruled those city-states to interpret the movements of the planets and develop both calendrical knowledge and astrological knowledge in the service of their king. And one of the public ways that they expressed this was through reenactments of the Mayan creation story, the Popol Vuh, for example, which established the king's relationship to the gods who had enacted the creation. And in these reenactments, the world was understood to be connected to the sky and to the underworld. And the night sky visually replayed parts of this story in its annual movement. So if you timed your ceremony right, the sky would participate. And I already mentioned before how Mars and two other planets put on a show above the Temple of Inscriptions on that night in 690. So, what did the crowd see that night? Well, anthropologists argue that they watched the reunion of the three gods who had given birth to their ancestors, then their disappearance behind the tomb, confirming the transfer of celestial power from father to son. And Mars on that night, shining bright and moving slowly through the constellations, was associated with one of the original gods of the creation, hence one of the oldest and one of the god's most powerful priests. So Mars was very important on that night. Now, the next examples we're going to talk about take place in Europe, and we're going to start in medieval Europe. But before we can go there, we have to talk about Aristotle and Claudius Ptolemy, who both became incredibly influential in the way that medieval Europeans um, conceptualized their universe. So Aristotle introduced this idea that the earth itself was made up of four earthly elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and that everything beyond the moon was made of this perfect substance called the ether. And everything on earth wanted either to move up or down. If you throw something in the air, it falls, right? Whereas everything beyond the moon wanted to move in circles, moved in perfect circles. So that was the idea, was that everything on earth is made of the four corruptible elements. You can be born, you can die, you grow old, there's rebirth, death, etc. But up in the heavens, everything is perfect and everything is permanent. And Ptolemy took that idea and made some changes to it so it actually could match up a little bit with observational astronomy, because the planets don't move in perfect circles, especially not as viewed from Earth in the night sky. But here we're going to talk about Ptolemy mainly because of his astrology. So Ptolemy, who was working in the Roman Egyptian city of Alexandria in the first century, um, he was working there in the city's museums and libraries, which were vast. And he had access to Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian knowledge, and his planetary astronomy was expressed primarily in his Almagest, which then became one of the most influential mathematical astronomical works in the medieval period. But his contributions didn't end with planetary astronomy. He had an idea of the value of the tool to the historical science of astrology. So for Ptolemy, in many ways, astronomy was a tool for astrology, and that was one of its primary values. So in addition to his Almagest, he also wrote a set of four books that's called the Tetrabiblos, the four books, devoted to a systematic study of the effects of the planets on the world that the humans inhabit underneath the moon, and about the practice of astrology on Earth. And these works contain arguments in favor of astrology, as well as a very encyclopedic presentation of ancient astrological knowledge. Um, and This astrology understood the planets to have influences on the sublunar world via this Aristotelian view that every part of the world was connected. So if you're looking at the diagram on the left of Aristotle's Aristotle's view of the cosmos, there's no empty space in there. So each of those spheres is filled with ether, and the ether is everywhere connected. And then once you get to the earth, everything is made of the four elements and everything there is connected. So influence can move throughout that system because there is no empty space. Um, and you know, when you then start thinking about what effects those planets might have on Earth, it was a range of effects depending on the qualities of those planets. So, what about Mars? How did Mars influence Ptolemy's world, and how is this going to, then become important in the examples we're going to talk about from the medieval period? Well, along with the other planets, Ptolemy's Mars had its role to play in determining the mental character and the physical features of the people of the world, and of course, the properties of the lands that they inhabited. So it's not just like the astrology that people might practice today, where the planets are affecting things about your daily life. It's actually an idea that the planets are affecting everything that's happening in the world. So Mars was close to the sun, it was bright, and so the nature of Mars was that it was dry and hot. And its nature was, according to Ptolemy, chiefly to dry and to burn. And the malevolence of Mars, because it was considered a malevolent planet in Ptolemy's view, could bring all kinds of ill effects. Its dryness could cause political problems, cause war, tyranny, civil unrest, arson, murder, piracy, enslavement. And to the human body, it could cause all kinds of medical symptoms, as mild as fevers or as severe as swift and violent death. Um, and it could also cause really unpleasant air and pestilence, lightning, hurricanes, drought, and could bring all kinds of other problems like plagues of locusts and fires and deaths of animals. Um, so in medieval Europe, they took this worldview that was, created by Aristotle and by Ptolemy, and they, wrapped it into their own, monotheistic Christian worldview. And in that, we're sort of borrowing from previous Islamic scholars who had done the same thing in the Islamic world, and Jewish scholars as well. Um, but it's important to think here, if you look at the diagram on the right, what we're talking about here when we talk about the planets is we're not talking about a bunch of worlds that are orbiting the Earth. We're talking about one world system or world machine in which the planets are playing a role, right? So the planets are not worlds in their own right. But they're incredibly important for the world. So, as the 14th century Parisian scholar Themin Judaeus wrote, every natural power of this inferior sensible world is governed by the heavens. Life is defined by change, birth, growth, maturation, degeneration, death, and decay. So, imagining a world in which planetary motion stopped was kind of like imagining a world in which all of the elements were frozen in place and no life could exist. So, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian natural philosophers saw this really as the purpose for which God had created the heavens, was to enact God's will on earth. And so they were a part of one divinely ordered world and not a series of worlds. They were defined by their effects on things, on bodies, and on places. So for physicians, if you're looking at the image on the left of your screen, for physicians who followed the teachings of Galen, Mars was most likely to affect the left ear, the kidneys, the veins, the gallbladder, and the genitals. And Ptolemy's treatise on astrology declared that Mars causes men to split blood, makes them melancholy, weakens their lungs, causes itch or scurvy. So, not a good planet for your health. And if one took the physics of this worldview seriously, which most late medieval natural philosophers did, then nothing made from the elements of Earth could actually travel into the heavens. And my book is about journeying into the heavens. You'd think that would be a problem. But somehow, medieval thinkers did find way to imagine voyaging to the planets or witnessing them up close. And they did so in ways that reflect not only the shape and structure of the medieval worldview, but the medieval view of the nature and purpose of human life, the mortality of the human body, and the eternal nature of the soul. And they did so in ways that evoked the ancient texts that they drew upon, as well as their enthusiasm for the powers that were held within those ancient texts. Right? And the most famous medieval journey through the universe is, without a doubt, Dante Alighieri's 14th century Divine Comedy. Um, I don't know if folks have read it. I'm always kind of surprised when I ask for a show of hands about who's read the Divine Comedy or at least parts of it, and to see how few people raise their hand. Because I thought when I was in high school and read parts of it that it was like required reading, but I guess not in every school district. But if we look at the Divine Comedy now and think about it as a story about Mars, which is what we're going to do now, we're really just talking about a series of 4 cantos. So bear with me. So the Divine Comedy is presented as a first person account of a journey through the 3 realms of the dead. So he goes through hell, purgatory, and then finally into the heavenly spheres in the Paradiso. And Dante's guide here is Beatrice, and the two of them are permitted to travel through the sphere of fire that rests against the moon sphere, um, at the edge of the human sensory world, and then to enter into the nine heavenly spheres, and finally into God's realm, the Empyrean. And so let's think about Dante's encounter with Mars, because he does go to all of the planets, but we really only care about Mars here. Well, one of the things that Dante learns from Beatrice as they're moving through the planets is that the spheres of the planets are each devoted to seven virtues. And Mars is found within the first four virtues, which are the cardinal virtues of prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance. And Dante decides to make Mars the planet of fortitude when he writes of his journey. And in keeping with the long held association of Mars with war, Dante imagines the sphere of Mars to be occupied with holy warriors who died as martyrs, who gave their lives the way that Christ did in the name of their Christian faith. So it's very much a Christian vision from a Christian poet. Um, and Mars, this stop at Mars is the middle of Dante's journey. It's the fifth of the nine spheres that he's going to describe, and it's really one of the most dramatic moments of the entire Paradiso. Dante had speculated in another text that because of its central position combined with its hot and dry qualities, Mars can appear as a ball of fire, flaming red with bright vapors in the sky. So it's not surprising that when Dante approaches Mars in the Paradiso, he's at first overwhelmed by its brightness. And when he sees Mars more clearly, it resolves into many sparks or rays of light that make a cross. And that's what you're seeing in the image on the right. It's a symbol of the ultimate martyr, and the cross is animated by the souls of the martyrs that it contains, and it emanates hymns of holy devotion. So it's an incredibly religious experience, kind of like a religious light show as Dante is approaching Mars and seeing this cross illuminated with these moving lights that are sort of flying up and down, side to side throughout the cross. And at one point, from amidst the lights that make up the cross, one of Dante's martyred ancestors actually comes to speak to him and explains to him the significance of the cross to the planet Mars, offers to name the martyrs who make up its light. And as the famous martyrs are named, their lights flash and move around the cross. And Dante describes visual experiences including a splendor thrust along the cross and a flame wheel round itself as he watches attentively, like he says, a falconer who tracks his falcon's flight. So Dante's description of this journey influenced imaginary journeys into the heavens, even after early telescopic observations began to reorder and transform the planets from these sort of ethereal points of light within these spheres, heavenly spheres, into actual worlds. And so here we come to our Jesuit priest, jumping from the 14th to the 17th century to a time after Galileo and Johannes Kepler had already sort of introduced their ideas, about Copernicus's reordering of the planets and why they thought, the planets were worlds and that the Earth was in fact a planet that was revolving around the sun. But it wasn't a Copernican who imagined one of the most detailed trips to Mars in the 17th century. It was a Jesuit scholar and a natural philosopher named Athanasius Kircher. And he's not the household name today that Galileo or Kepler are, obviously, but in his day, Kircher was the center of a very large and active intellectual network. And Kircher had a keen interest in astronomy, astrology, alchemy, and magic, and of course, as a Jesuit, Christianity. He observed eclipses, studied the sky with telescopes, made his own observations of sunspots, and produced and published depictions of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. But when it came to his own ideas about the ordering of the solar system, he kept his ideas a little bit to himself. But in 1657, he published his own imagined journey to the planets in a work that he called the Itinerarium Ecstaticum, or the ecstatic journey. In this story, we meet a character named Theodidactus, which means taught by God, and I'm just going to call him Theo from here on out, who is transported to the planetary spheres by the angel Cosmiel. So, very similar to Dante, he is being taken up into the planets by an angel instead of a muse. But the Mars that Cosmiel and Theo visit on their voyage is not based on any of the known features of the planet Mars, and Kierkegaard doesn't provide any drawings or maps to go along with this piece. Unfortunately, all we have is the engraving from the front of the book. But he honestly wouldn't have had access to very much information about Mars in 1657. Maybe some vague descriptions of what others had observed through telescopes, but there weren't really very detailed drawings yet of Mars, and telescopes honestly weren't good enough to resolve very many details about Mars. So Mars, for Kierkegaard, it's his own invention, and it's based on his own speculations about the planet, its influence on humans, and its bright red appearance. And as Theo and Cosmiel travel from the sun to Mars, Theo begins to feel the planet's malevolence. So already in the very beginning of his encounter with Mars, we start to encounter a Mars that's very informed by ideas from astrology and from alchemy. So he says, "It seems as if I'm not so much seeing some hellish globe with my eyes as smelling the incredible stench of its vapors, and it's not lifeless, it's roiled by a huge whirling vortex. Stop, stop," he says, "don't take me any nearer. I can tell that globe holds evil things in store for me. There's some kind of deep-seated fury inside me, and I seem to be burning with a sense of rage and indignation." So Mars is having a terrible effect on Theo as he approaches it. It's really, the types of things that Ptolemy had described of what it could do to your body, what it could do to your mind, the types of problems it could bring into existence, the wars, fighting, etc. But these ill effects are relieved when the angel gives Theo an antidote and is able to put him at ease and allows him to breathe normally in the foul air of the planet. And he explains that the planet is made of a violent influence and conflicted by a battle of the elements at war. And so, even with the antidote that Cosmiel gives to Theo, Mars is still a pretty unpleasant place to visit. So, the way that Kierkegaard describes it through Theo's observations is that it's made primarily of sulfur and bitumen and arsenic. That when he gets set down on the rim of a volcano to observe, he surveys the landscape and he sees it to be rocky and mountainous and covered in fireball spewing volcanoes and lakes. And the angel takes him to the edge of a flaming ocean of pitch and bitumen, rough and scaly in appearance and porridge-like in consistency. And so Theo asks the question, why such a terrible planet would even exist in nature? What's its purpose? And Cosmiel reminds him that Mars, like all of the other planets, the more beautiful and benevolent ones, is a work of God and part of the universe's greater whole. Don't call what God has set up with such foresight for the preservation and ornament of the universe names like disgusting and pestilent, he warns him. And, Theo stands scorned and corrected. And just to give you a sense of Kierkegaard's view, he was one who also subscribed to the idea that everything is connected, that this is how the influences of the heavens are felt on Earth, is that the human body is basically a microcosm of the larger universe and is connected to those things that are happening in the movements of the universe. So you can see here the figure at the center. On one of his hands is the sun, on his feet are the stars and the planets, and then his other arm is chained to what we can assume is, I think, the hand of God coming out from the top of this engraving. So now we're going to jump again. we're going to jump into the late 19th century to the astronomer Percival Lowell, who promoted his own idea of planetary evolution. His idea was that planets start out wet and that over time they become desert worlds. And their size has something to do with this. So, for example, the moon is very small and it is completely dry and dead. Mars, smaller than Earth, larger than the moon, is becoming dry. It's not yet completely dry, but it is very much becoming a desert world. And when he looked at Mars, he saw it covered in canals, which had first been described by the Italian astronomer Schiaparelli, but that Lowell had made sort of a bit of a career speculating about what those canals actually meant. So he saw these canals as evidence of a large coordinated civil engineering project that had to be conducted by a race of very intelligent Martians who were very organized. Um, and he thought the Martians were contending with the drying planet. They were trying to irrigate their crops and keep their population alive. And ultimately, though, he thought this is the fate of the Earth. Earth would eventually succumb to this same drying effect. The deserts of the Earth would grow and spread, um, and eventually humans would have to contend with the same exact problem. Well, Lowell's ideas provoked a lot of sensational journalism and stories about Martians in the late 20th and late 19th and early 20th century. And the most famous reaction, of course, to Lowell's Martians is H.G. Wells's novel, The War of the Worlds, which has remained incredibly popular throughout the years and has had several film adaptations, of course. But in the story, these resource-starved Martians come to Earth to take what they need from humans who have to run for their lives from beings who don't regard them as intelligent equals, but at most just a sort of nuisance to the project that they're undertaking. And for Wells, of course, this wasn't just science fiction based on Lowell's ideas, but was also a satirical comment on the British Empire and its exploits abroad and its tendency to sort of, uh, you know, bulldoze over the cultures that it was interacting with. Now, jumping later into the 20th century, in the 1960s and 70s, Mars transformed into something more similar to what we know today. And this was thanks to robotic exploration, first by flybys and orbiters in the 1960s and 70s, and then finally in 1976 by the landing of the two Viking landers. And all of this was done in the context of a Cold War space race in which, in many ways, planetary exploration was an extension of the sort of militarism of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. But what it found was that Mars had no life at all. Whereas when the first Mariner missions flew to Mars, there was a hope that there would at least be some very simple form of life, like maybe a lichen or some kind of simple plant life on the surface of Mars. What was found in the end was a planet of rock, right? So it was a planet that had seemingly an interesting geologic past of its own. It had giant volcanoes and huge trenches, but no life to be seen, at least not in the present. And so, fiction about Mars was no longer about existing Martian life, but about bringing life to Mars, right? About humans maybe one day setting foot on Mars and doing something there. But what? What would be the purpose of humans going to Mars? And in a sort of a reversal of Wells's idea of Martians coming to Earth for resources, we have, for example, stories like 1990's Total Recall, humans going to Mars to get the resources and bringing along all of their economic and social problems. And that brings us closer to the present, where we now have rovers exploring the surface of Mars, and even small helicopters that have been sent to Mars to do some exploration as well. And, it's been in many ways an unprecedented period of Mars exploration. We've now had rovers roving on the surface of Mars continuously for 20 years, which is pretty remarkable. We've also grown very accustomed to consuming images of Mars from those rovers, and in many ways, we relate our consumption of those images to our sharing of images with one another. So, for example, this XKCD comic about the Opportunity rover shows the rover kind of participating in the types of things that we use our communications technology for, which is sharing all of the cool things that we see and get to do with our friends and the people connected to us. These images have become so familiar to us that it's easy to replace a rover in one of these photos with the idea of a human on Mars, like, for example, this scene from Ridley Scott's The Martian. You can feel like that scene looks familiar because not only does it look a lot like the American southwestern desert, but it also looks like images you've seen probably if you follow Mars on or any kind of NASA social media platforms. And it's easy for us to imagine a future on Mars where it's not just one solitary explorer, but maybe an entire population of people who have come to consider themselves Martian, right? Humans become the Martians in some of our stories about Mars and its purpose. And, you know, uh, this has most famously, I think, well, maybe not most famously, but one of my favorite examples is The Expanse, which was what we just saw the image from in the previous slide. And we were recently able to collect this helmet that was used in in The Expanse. But one of the interesting things I think about this uh, show and the books that it's based on is this idea that the Martian humans on Mars can become so distinct from the humans on Earth that they really start to think of themselves as having a completely different identity that they need to defend from their adversaries on Earth. But connected to all of those ideas about what our future could look like on Mars and whether or not, you know, humans should be sent to Mars and in what way, um, is also this emerging idea that started to come out in the 1990s of Mars maybe not always having been this rocky planet, but maybe having been more of a ocean planet like the Earth is now, right? Maybe not quite as habitable as Earth, but maybe there was a time about 3 billion years ago that it was warm and wet and the conditions for life were right. And you know, putting together the story of where that water went and why Mars isn't habitable today has been one of the primary concerns of planetary geologists who study Mars over the past years. But it also hints at, right, a possibility that Mars could be habitable again someday. And so the technologies for doing that are already under works, right? We back in 2022, NASA tested this inflatable heat shield that could be used on a mission to Mars to send humans to Mars because the technologies you need to land a human mission on Mars would be very large. And so being able to save weight by producing inflatable heat shield as opposed to very solid heat shields like were used traditionally in the Apollo missions up through the missions that are being flown today in preparation for Artemis would really help a human Mars mission. And so NASA is already um, developing these technologies and playing with the idea of solving the problems of going to Mars. Although, um, at least for my whole lifetime and probably, my parents' lifetime, Mars and putting humans on Mars has always been about 20 years away, and that 20-year mark keeps moving, right? So, whether or not we will actually go to Mars is really still an open question, even though the technology is being developed and NASA has plans to try and do it. after the Artemis landings on the moon, that this would be the next step. Um, it's really still a very open question that I think most of the NASA observers, including myself, um, are waiting for some real clues about what will happen next. Well, on that note of speculation about an unknown future, I'm going to say thank you. This was a very fun book to write, and I really enjoy talking about it with audiences. And so I look forward to your questions. And meanwhile, I've put up information here, like my email address at the Smithsonian, if you want to write to me with any questions. And also another plug for the Airspace podcast, which I think, if you enjoyed this talk, you'll probably enjoy the podcast. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was so interesting. We have a ton of fantastic questions. I'm just going to jump right in with Dennis's question, since you just talked about kind of always saying that we're 20 years away from life on Mars. Dennis asks, with the explosion of AI, why is it necessary to have people on board to explore Mars? Reducing the cost and eliminating the risk to people, just have AI robots explore Mars.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, at the moment, there's not a lot of artificial intelligence in, for example, the rovers that we send to Mars. Those rovers have a very small ability to think for themselves, mainly to avoid hazards and other things. But the thinking is mostly done by teams of humans on the ground. So we're using human intelligence right now to explore Mars with robots. If artificial intelligence does continue to progress to where we could have an intelligent robot exploring Mars and sharing that information back with Earth as sort of more of a fully fledged team member, then I think we could probably explore Mars faster than we do right now. Because right now, because of the time delays in communicating with a rover, which can be pretty severe depending on how far Earth is from Mars, um, uh, we have to explore very slowly. And so artificial intelligence might help us explore faster with robots. But right now, I don't think that's on the immediate horizon, but hopefully in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, Abigail from Orange County Library System wants to know, what are some things that excite you the most about the future of Mars exploration?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know what its future is, but Mars sample return is something that a lot of people have been waiting for a long time. And, um, the Perseverance rover has been collecting rock samples and setting them aside for a future mission, for those samples to be brought back to Earth and studied in laboratories, the way that the Apollo moon samples were brought back and studied in laboratories. And we learned a ton about the moon from that. And I think we'll learn a ton about Mars if we get these samples back. Right now, NASA is sort of looking for ways of doing that are less complicated and less expensive than what they already had planned. But hopefully, those plans will still go forward and we'll get those samples back from Mars. Because I think that's the next big thing that's coming from Mars. Before we send humans there, we're going to get those samples back.
I want to ask one more question about kind of the exploration of Mars. Karen is asking or saying, in your last chapter, you mention future Mars exploration and how more nations / people / companies must work together, in addition to who do we want to be when we become Martians, and perhaps solving global warming and other terrestrial problems. What else would exploring Mars allow us to learn and do? Karen says, I know it's a big question, but perhaps mention a few goals and benefits.
Yes, it's a big question. Well, I think that going to Mars, sending humans to Mars is going to be a huge project. It's going to take a lot of resources, a lot of money. And so it's not something that I think, at least with the technologies that we have now, any one nation or any one company is going to be able to do alone. It's going to have to be a collaborative effort. And, I think ideally it should be an effort that benefits the most people. And
Mhm.
that's why I think that, there should be a lot of people at the table in thinking about why we're going to Mars and what we want to do when we get there and how it should reflect who we are, what our values are, how we feel about each other, etc. Like I mean, I guess I'm asking a little bit for sort of a utopian plan, but what I'm really thinking is like when I thought about these historical examples, it's clear that the way that different cultures at different times saw Mars was affected by who they thought they were and how they related to the universe. And I just want us to kind of think of ourselves that way and be explicit about what we think, what our anxieties are, why we're really trying to do this, what this money should be used for, and how it relates to our lives back on Earth.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad that you brought up kind of like historical culture questions because we have quite a few questions. I'm going to put them together about the history of other cultures for Mars. So, Amy from East Baton Rouge Parish Library says, we call Mars Mars, but what is the name used by other cultures for Mars? And in that same respect, um, Sarah, sorry, I was looking for her name. Sarah said, how different were recognitions of Mars as this reddish planet historically, and how did various cultures describe and interpret the color? So I guess like name and physical attributes of Mars.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorites is from ancient Chinese astrology. They called Mars the sparkling deluder,
Huh.
um, because could be very bright and red in the heavens. And they also associated it with heat and with fire. And they had the part of the sky that Mars was associated with was also associated with um, uh, a character called the vermilion bird, which was kind of like a phoenix. Um, so yeah, that's one of my favorite examples. But the ancient words for Mars, from Latin to Spanish to all of these other languages, are built into um, you know the way we talk about days of the week, right?
Mm.
Tuesday, which in Spanish is Martes, is the day of Mars, right? So, the words that other cultures at other times have used for Mars are kind of baked into some of the language that we use even still today.
Interesting. Very interesting. Silas says, and do we know how old Mars is?
Yeah, I mean, we know that Mars is essentially the same age as the Earth. They were all formed at the same time, all of the planets. So what is it, 3.5 billion years or 4.5 billion years? I can never remember. I think 4.5 sounds right to me.
That sounds right. Ray is asking, the depiction of the Mayan Mars beast had what I believe are numbers beneath the figures. Is that correct? If so, can you explain the significance of the numbers?
I can't give you too much detail, unfortunately. But the like I said, the tables that are associated with the Mars beast is water tables,
Hmm.
and so I would assume that those numbers may be part of counting the cycle of the rainy seasons or something of that sort. But you can find sources online from archaeologists who have done more to try and interpret parts of that codex. If you look up the Dresden Codex, that's where that came from.
Okay. Okay. Michael is wondering, how in the world did Aristotle figure out the relative positions of the planets as documented in the sketch you displayed?
Oh, well, that's a good question. It wasn't original to him. So the order of the planets was already sort of um, available. People had sort of noticed positions of the planets in the sky over thousands of years prior to Aristotle coming on the scene. And so, Babylonians and Egyptians and others had already developed ideas about, to some extent, about the structure of the cosmos, but they hadn't put it into that sort of geometric formation. So, people, there were all kinds of arguments about where Mercury should be because, Mercury is so close to the sun. Sometimes it seems to be on one side, sometimes the other. The same can be true of Venus. So, there were arguments within the circles of natural philosophers about that order, but generally, the order that was shown uh, in that diagram is what people generally believed.
Okay. Graham from Los Gatos Library is wondering, Graham says, so many past assumptions about Mars seem quaint and misguided by today's scientific standards, a pattern which will no doubt continue. If you had to pick one, which of our current beliefs about our red neighbor do you think will cause giggles in the classroom when it's told to students 200 years from now?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Um, hmm. Well, I mean, we make a lot of, I shouldn't say we, but scientists, right? They have to make assumptions in order to do their work, and sometimes it's the assumptions that turn out to be, um, the fault, right? That brings down the house of all of the other facts, or whatever, the house of cards, the house of facts. But so we make this assumption about why Mars sort of took the path that it did.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it go from being a warm, wet world similar to the Earth to being this dry desert world? And what we assume is, because it's smaller than the Earth, it cooled faster, the core stopped spinning, it lost its electromagnetic field, and then, the atmosphere started to escape. But, we're finding all kinds of evidence of subsurface water ice, and we know that there's ice at the poles. And I'm wondering, if one day we might look back at this story we tell about how Mars got to be the way it is today, and the assumptions underneath that about the nature of planets. It's such a big assumption. I'm wondering if that might be what what we might laugh at in the future. But as a historian, it's so hard to look at the science of today and think, you know, what's going to be wrong, what's ultimately going to lead to advances, because usually we're just looking backwards and thinking about how people worked and how they came up with the knowledge that we have today. So yeah, it's hard to speculate, but I wonder if, that story of where the water went and why Mars is dry today is going to change over time.
Mm-hmm. Bryn from Detroit Public Library says, many of the interpretations of Mars I have experienced have been male coded, from Mars as god of war, Mars in science fiction serials, to the idea of colonizing and surviving Mars by figures like Elon Musk. Are there any notable feminine interpretations of Mars, especially from other cultures?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I can't think of any big, great examples, but the if we're thinking about popular culture, I think one of my favorite examples is from the helmet that I showed in one of my earlier slides, which was the helmet that's worn by the character Bobby Draper, who is a Martian Marine, and it's part of her power armor suit. And that character is played by this incredible actor Frankie Adams, and so she is this very strong female Martian character that I think maybe is a counterpoint to like the earlier Edgar Rice Burroughs novels, Princess of Mars, where the women on Mars were princesses or servants. Here we have like a Marine, right? So,
Yeah.
I think she's a great example, at least from contemporary science fiction.
And The Expanse is a very, very good show. I haven't read the books, but I did watch the show.
Oh yeah, if you haven't, for the those in the audience, if you haven't watched The Expanse, you should. It's a great show.
It is. Definitely is. Penny is asking, is there a sequel title on the astonishing archaeological artifacts that have been seen on Martian surface, as well as the evident ancient biosphere as in the Northern Sea and Southern Settlement? I'm not sure. Oh, you're muted, Matt. Hold on. Let me unmute you. I'm not sure what happened there. Matt seems to be muted. Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. I wasn't able to unmute you for some reason.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think I had an AirPod issue that then caused a muting issue.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question. Sorry, I didn't hear the whole thing,
Oh,
but I think I see it on the screen. A sequel title?
Or is anybody, or do you know of any research taking place on archaeological artifacts that have been seen on the Martian surface? Have there been archaeological artifacts seen on the Martian surface?
Well, I mean, there have been some things that people have noticed that look like they could be archaeological artifacts, right? There was a period back in the 1970s where I think it was a Viking orbiter photograph appeared to show like a face on Mars. And that became a very popular image. But when later missions looked at it, it confirmed that it was basically the way that the shadows were falling at the time, that it was a normal rock that just happened to look like a face. And as far as I know, no actual archaeological things have been found on Mars. Everything that's been seen can be explained just through natural processes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask one more question. I know we're at the top of the hour. Closing with Denise. How do we continue to cultivate an interest and understanding of the nature of Mars, and how is that important to our future?
Yeah, well, in terms of humans leaving Earth, right, there are really only two good destinations for us if we're thinking about, solid bodies in our solar system, and that's the moon, which is right next door to us and can get there in a few days, and Mars, which is a much longer, more arduous journey that takes 7 to 9 months, and a lot more technology. And so, nonetheless, if we want to be an interplanetary species, which some people say we should be, then Mars is probably the best answer here in our solar system. And if we ever want to get out of our solar system and visit any of the planets that are orbiting around other stars that have been discovered since the early 2000s, then we're going to have to learn how to get to Mars first. Because getting out there is going to be a lot harder than getting to Mars, but we'll, take one step at a time, I guess.
Maybe that's what they'll giggle about in 200 years from now, is how long it took us today to get to Mars. All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time and all the wisdom that you imparted upon us today. I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our audience members for joining us. Without your support, none of this would be possible. We thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, if you scroll down just below, you'll see a resources area. And in that resources area, you can find a link to Matt's book, For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet. And because we know you need more about Mars and other planetary exploration, we've also added a link to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in that resources area. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you all next week on June 13th when we chat with the Queen of Thrill herself, Frida McFadden, and then again on June 20th when we talk to best-selling author Tiffany Jewell about her newest book, Everything I Learned About Racism I Learned in School. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.